Okay, so welcome everybody to today's session on careers in educational psychology with Dr. Caitriona Martyn and Grainne McDonald from the National Educational Psychological Service. Thanks very much for attending, everybody. I know this is a very popular topic, and Caitriona has some really good news about funding, which she will be talking about. But look, I'm going to stop talking and we're just going to get straight into it. So, Caitriona, I'm going to hand straight over to you if that's okay.
Great. Thank you so much for the welcome, Patsy. So hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us during your lunch hour this afternoon. So as Patsy said, my name is Caitriona and I'm an educational psychologist with NEPS. And I suppose NEPS is one of our biggest employer of educational psychologists in Ireland. So myself and Grainne both work for the Department of Education. I'm joined by Grainne, who unfortunately cannot get her camera to work today because she's reporting live, as we say, coming in live from a school, and that's the nature of our work. So maybe the bandwidth isn't strong enough, so apologies there, but we will hear from Grainne as we proceed. So I suppose the last time myself and Grainne would have spoken to students in UL, I suppose it was different times. Students weren't funded to train as educational psychologists. But thankfully now, all of our students undertaking the doctoral training in Mary I and in UCD are either fully funded by ourselves in NEPS or by the HSC. So I suppose that for any of you considering a career in educational psychology, and I suppose heretofore really it was only clinical psychologists who were trained. So it's really been a huge change, and I suppose it opens up opportunities for so many students from all backgrounds in Irish society to have that opportunity to go on and train. So really myself and Grainne this afternoon will give you a little overview, I suppose, of the work of educational psychologists, the services and areas we work in, show you the depth and variety of our work, give you a little insight into our work as educational psychologists in NEPS, how we both came to train as educational psychologists, and then we'll take you through the universities where you can train on this island to become an educational psychologist, and some little tips on interview process and all of that. So we'll get going. So I like this poster. It comes from NASP, which is the National Association of School Psychologists in the States. So I guess in the States, we're referred to school psychologists because they typically have a psychologist working in one school. On the island of Ireland and in the UK, Australia, lots of other jurisdictions, we're referred to as educational psychologists. And I suppose really what are we doing, as the poster says, we're supporting students' ability to learn and teachers' ability to teach. And you'll see as we go through this talk today, myself and Grainne, so much of our work is supporting school systems. And we're really looking at students and supporting students in terms of their learning, their behaviour, mental health and well-being, and those school systems from management right down. So we're looking at academic, behaviour, mental health supports. We're looking at assessment and data analysis, and so much of our work is supporting students to get, supporting teachers to gather really rich, valuable data. We do so much consultation work with parents, with teachers, and the important key adults in a young person's life. Our school communities have changed very significantly in recent times. We're always looking at culturally responsive service, and a lot of our work is involved with crisis prevention and response. So many of you, when you hear of NEPS in the media, it's usually in response to a critical incident, a significant event in a school community. So we're looking at struggling and diverse learners. We're looking at student achievement and well-being. We really want students to feel that they belong in their school community, that they're connected to school staff, and they feel that they're in a safe and supportive learning environment. We really try to engage with school, with families, and obviously all of those people, colleagues working in interagencies like the HSC, CAMS, primary care services. And again, we're really looking at supporting school-wide database decision making. So again, when schools are deciding who needs support, that they've lots of rich data to back up the decision making process. So where do we work? So as you can see there, some of us work in NEPS, Other psychologists, educational psychologists, work in health and social care systems. So that could be, for example, working on a network disability team, supporting children and young people from literally birth to the age of 18. Some educational psychologists work in our CAMS team, so that's supporting the mental health of our young people. And many work in primary care settings. Then, for example, I would have spent time working on the Brothers of Charity. You've heard of a lot of Jigsaw, Enable Ireland. Some psychologists, education psychologists, would work in third level institutions in the disability office, or we have a trainee educational psychologist here with us at the moment, and she worked on a student support team in Maynooth University before going on to train. Many educational psychologists work in academia or in research. So even myself, I would have worked as a PhD researcher before going on to train, and some continue to work in private practice. So just to give you a sense of where we work, and there is lots of variety and lots of settings looking for educational psychologists at this time. Grainne, do you want to come in here?
Yes, thanks, Caitriona. And I'm so sorry, everyone, that for some reason my camera can't work. But you can imagine, you can imagine me. So the kind of work, as Caitriona alluded to, that we do as educational psychologists, and we see that it falls into these 5 broad categories. So we would say about casework, whether that is direct casework, where we might do individual work with a young person or a child, and that can involve doing traditional kind of assessments that you might know of, like cognitive assessments. It can involve assessments of adaptive functioning, so how well you're able to manage your world, things around mental health, and it can also involve doing interventions with those individual children and young people, depending on the context in which we work. So if we work in Jigsaw, our work will primarily be focused on doing low-level mental health interventions with children and young people. The other kind of work that we focus quite a lot on is what is largely described as building capacity within systems, or support and development work. And that looks often like doing training teachers in specific interventions programs, whether they're around literacy or mental health or well-being, doing parent workshops, and they might be things you've heard of like Triple P or Parents Plus or Timid to Tiger. They're looking at developing particular skills where parents can feel better able to support their child with a particular area of need or an area for development. The kind of systemic work that Caitriona mentioned, and that's actually quite more typically associated with psychologists working in NEPS, where Caitriona and I now both work. So that kind of national piece where we have responsibility for the National Wellbeing Office, so looking at policy development and intervention development around wellbeing for entire populations, and our population is typically the school-going population, so between 4 and 19 or 20, or that idea of responding to critical incidents, so supporting communities and families in the aftermath of a significant event that has impacted on their school community, whether it's something very high profile that has been in the newspapers, or it might be the unfortunate bereavement around a member of their school community. Also, the idea of we have a special role as we work for the Department for Education around developing policy within the department. So whether it's policy around special education, around well-being, around provision and intervention for particular highlighted minoritized groups, whether they're children with additional educational needs, or they're from, I suppose, wider socially minoritized populations, so members of the traveller or Roma community, our newly arrived population, children from Ukraine. So we would help as psychologists to think about research and evidence-informed practice that is, I suppose, universal or around the world, that's helping us say, how can we best support these communities or these particular group of people? And a huge amount of our work is around that idea of advocacy or inclusion, and thinking about supporting cultural and linguistic diversity. So looking at particular populations, so even the idea of children who have English as an additional language, I suppose a lot of our work as psychologists is to say, well, actually, maybe that's an opportunity. So it is a particular area of need that we need to support our school communities, to support them to develop their additional language. But actually, instead of being children who have a deficit in this area, we'd see them as developing multilinguists. So they have the potential to develop even more language groups. I don't know if I can't. Oh, great. So as you kind of mentioned, the kind of broad areas of casework that educational psychologists work is the whole spectrum, I suppose, of things that impact on children. In Ireland, typically it would be up to around 18 or 19 if they're in school. In other jurisdictions, it's considered the age of 0 to 25. So in the UK, educational psychologists would have responsibility for children and young people up to the age of 25. And it's looking at things like cognition and learning, language and social emotional communication difficulties, mental health and well-being, adaptive functioning and daily living skills. And the kind of work that we might do, it might involve consultations, whether that's directly with the child or young person or with their communities of support, whether it's with intervening and supporting their teachers, the other adults who work with them at school, and the adults, their parents or caregivers in their family home. It might involve doing observations, those kind of standardized assessments that you might be familiar with, and non-standardized assessments, which are typically what we would call dynamic assessment. And they work on Vygotsky's principles of the zone of proximal development and mediated learning experiences. So what can a child do without support? And then when we provide an intervention or mediation, how are they now able to achieve that skill? So it's looking at where is the intervention best placed and what kind of intervention works best. Then I suppose the kind of practice as practitioner psychologists, applied psychologists, we're always thinking that things that we are doing are grounded in research and what we would describe as evidence-based practice. So that can involve doing whole systems work. So whether that's with an entire school community, a classroom community, a family community, doing work with individuals or groups within a school, doing things like cognitive behavioral therapeutic practice, person-centered planning, solution-focused brief practice, psychodynamic, personal construct psychology, are these things like video interaction guidance or video-enhanced reflective practice. So that's a VIG and VERP. And their kind of interventions typically is also on this National Institute of Clinical Excellence, the NICE guidelines. Their interventions typically focused on attachment-related differences. So that's the first line intervention. So they're the kind of interventions we might be using. So as we said, this kind of systems-based work or our support and development work is about thinking about building capacity amongst a whole system to be able to meet children's needs. So that can involve doing things like interagency work. So because I suppose as psychologists, for us working in the education system, we see children across the full spectrum of human life and experience. So we often work with children who are care experienced, or children who might be seeking asylum or have refugee status, or lots of other protected or minoritized groups. A lot of our work is focused on, and I suppose we kind of, based on where we work, we have a particular responsibility or particular role around preventative work. So using evidence-informed interventions across the whole population, so universal interventions to actually provide or help children and school communities to develop skills to prevent things becoming. So particularly say around anxiety. So how can we support school communities and children to develop skills of emotional identification and regulation and coping skills? Then things around doing interventions around emotionally based school avoidance, or what we now would call reluctant attendance or school avoidant behaviour, support around children who have autism or developmental language delay, lots of different difficulties across the school. Thinking about applying interventions that are focused on language development or literacy development, and what is, I suppose, thinking all the time as practitioner scientists, how effective was this intervention? What is the area of skill we need to do? Did I select the right intervention? And what was the impact of that intervention? So we're always trying to use a scientific lens to think about the interventions and what we're doing to support school communities. Things like parenting support, developing trauma-informed skills, behavior management programs, and then, as you mentioned before, about that kind of idea of critical incident support in schools. So I suppose what often we think about when we think about educational psychology, I suppose we often think about our role as psychologists within systems and having systems thinking at the heart of our practice. So a child isn't just an individual, it's not just about their individualized experience in school, but actually they're experience within lots of different systems that are coming together within a school community. So our practice is typically founded in the idea of ecological systems theory. So Bronfenbrenner's theory, if you've come across him in your undergraduate courses. So he works on this principle that there are these 5 predominant systems that work in an individual experiences throughout their life, and they're kind of like bi-directional relationships. So it's not just the individual relationship that the individual has with themselves, but the relationships other entities have within that system. So at the center of it, we always say we have the microsystem. So that's anyone who has direct contact with the child, whether that's their parents, their siblings, their caregivers, their school staff, other interventionists that, if they work with a speech and language therapists. So that's their relationship with them and the relationship with other people, within that. The mesosystem is the next layer, and that's actually that the idea that individual systems that a person has a relationship don't operate individually, but actually those systems have an influence on each other and a relationship with each other. And sometimes when we're explaining this, we might say that, if a parent doesn't like your friends, that actually parents, that has an impact on your relationship with your friends. It might enhance that relationship, or it might have an impact that actually that relationship will dissipate over time. So there's a relationship that other people within your system have with other entities within that. The idea of the exosystem, so that's kind of like formal and informal social structures. So even things like the funding that is applied to systems. So the funding that's given to CAMS or primary care, to TUSLR, to the school systems, actually that has an impact on how an individual copes and manages within that system. And I suppose their ability to thrive within a system. So if there's lots of funding for, say, schools or mental health services, then actually interventions can happen earlier. Things can be more enhanced, and you're less likely to have, predominant difficulties as you move through a system. However, if, because of austerity or other difficulties, that if there isn't as much funding available, or even there isn't as many practitioners available within that system, then actually that has a cumulative impact on, I suppose, when the intervention happens and how long that intervention needs to happen. The idea around that is the macro system. So that's what we call cultural elements. So it's ideologies, attitudes, beliefs, and I suppose social conditions. And I suppose thinking about the idea of how established society and culture impacts on a child's development. So that's, the ideas that we have about particular aspects of ourselves and how they are create, I suppose, oppression or privilege within a system for each individual. And the final system is what we call the chronosystem. And that's kind of like shifts and transitions over a child's lifetime. And they can either be predictable shifts. So, the transition between, preschool to primary to secondary to further education or employment, or the shifts that are unpredictable, whether they are like familial discord, so familial separation and the impact that has on your progression through your life and impact on all the systems around you, or things like even recession, because that might impact on your own opportunity to seek employment or your parents' opportunity to hold or maintain employment. And so I think it's about thinking about, it's not just what's happening within the systems, but those kind of transitions within a system.
Brilliant, Grainne. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Now, we might, Grainne, just for the next couple of minutes, give attendees this afternoon just, I suppose, an overview of how myself and Grainne both got to train as educational psychologists. And you'll see that we've come from very different routes. And I suppose that's just something to be mindful of. It's all about getting your experience, especially with children and young people. So in my own example, I actually came back to psychology later than normal. And I suppose I had spent some time living and working in France and working as a primary school teacher. Now, just to reiterate, you don't have to be a qualified primary teacher or a post-primary teacher to train as an educational psychologist. I think that myth can still exist out there. Obviously, we're looking for experience with children and young people. So I actually went back to study psychology, And I suppose because I had been working in a bilingual environment, I was very interested in language and literacy from the outset. And that led me on, I did my BA in NUIG, now UOG, and I went on to complete a PhD there. I was lucky to secure funding, and I actually worked in a number of language classes and reading classes at primary level, and looked at, I suppose, the auditory and visual processes of learning to read and develop language. And I always had an interest in becoming an educational psychologist, and more specifically in working in NEPS. So I then went on to do my master's in UCD. Again, that is just my pathway. There's no prerequisite to have a doctorate before you go on to train. The course was a master's at that time, and I spent 2 years in UCD training. So I'm going to hand you over to Grainne now, because her route is very different to mine. But I think it's important that we give you a flavour and a sense of how many of us got to qualify as EPs. So Grainne, over to you again.
Okay, thanks, Caitriona. So I actually studied up when I did my Leaving Cert. I wasn't really certain what I want. It's a big decision. I wasn't certain what I wanted to do, and I definitely didn't know anything about psychology. So I went to do medicine. And I often say that I met the cadaver and I knew medicine wasn't for me. So then I tried out. I was in Trinity College, and they allowed me to try out different courses. So I did law for a few weeks, and I did economics and a few different things. But the only subject I really liked was psychology. But when I went home to tell my parents and I was like, oh, I want to switch into psychology, they were like, that's not a real job. They were like, you need to have something to back up. So my mum suggested that I do a course. So I'm actually familiar with UL. So I did in Mary I this course called B.Ed in psychology. So I got 2 simultaneous degrees, so one in psychology and one in education, so I could work as a primary school teacher. And at the end of my course, I still loved, and I was still really interested in psychology, but my ideas around psychology were definitely based on clinical practice. That was really, I'd never heard of an educational psychologist. The first time I heard of it was when I was in Limerick, and I didn't really understand what they did. And so I still had kind of a traditional idea about becoming a clinical psychologist. So I worked for about a year and a half as an as a primary school teacher. And then I went and worked, I did a master's at the same time in child and adolescent mental health in Trinity College. And then I worked for something called the Mental Health Commission. So that's working with, and I did these things called mental health tribunals. So I worked with a barrister and a psychiatrist and different ones. And we would do these tribunals. They're like court sessions for people who are held under an involuntary court or mental health order. So it's where somebody has made, a psychiatrist or other mental health professionals have made a decision that this person, because of a mental health disorder, is unable to make a good decision about their own health and well-being, and so forth. They have to be detained to seek appropriate treatment to alleviate this condition. And so our job would be to make a decision about whether that detention, as they were called, whether that order was appropriate or not, and whether this person presented. So I did get to go around to a lot of mental health hospitals across Ireland, and places like the Central Mental Health Hospital, and it really gave me an understanding of clinical practice. But what it copper fastened for me was the idea that I would like to work maybe in more preventative type of, as a psychologist, doing preventative work. So maybe we could intervene earlier to, I suppose, be better able to recognize these mental health conditions, or to provide people with opportunities to develop coping skills. So they didn't need to be placed under this, to the same degree. So a lecturer in college had told me about educational psychology, and I remembered from being in Mary I, and so I applied to do professional training. And so that's how I ended up in educational psychology. So it was more of a circuitous route, rather than, I suppose, knowing from the start, like Caitriona, when she went back to psychology, she knew she wanted to be an educational psychologist, but it was really circumstances and the kind of practice that I wanted to engage in that helped me to think about educational psychology.
Brilliant, Grainne. So I'm just going to give you a flavour of NEPS, I suppose, the organisation. who both myself and Grainne work for. And NEPS is a core part of the Department of Education. We're actually civil service servants, myself and Grainne, even though, I mean, we don't refer to ourselves as a civil service, we call ourselves educational psychologists. But just to give you a flavour there, you can see in the map on your screens, we have 8 regional directors, we have 23 offices. You can see we're patched right around the country. Grainne lives in Roscommon but works in our Galway office. I live in Galway but work in our Mayo office. And you can see it is quite a significant number of staff, 230 psychologists. We also employ counselling and clinical psychologists, just to say that, you know, we're not just all educational psychologists. And you can see there in the budget 2022, 54 more psychologists were sanctioned to join, and they're going through induction at the moment, so we will have new colleagues joining us. But just to give you a sense of our model of service in NEPS, so on the left-hand side of your screen, as Grainne alluded to earlier, a lot of our work is involved with casework. So that can be direct casework with the child, or it can be indirect, meeting with maybe the key people in their lives, such as parents and guardians. A huge amount of our work is involved in support and development. That can be meeting with the school and doing their planning at the start of the year and trying to help a school to identify the needs in their school. It can be advisory and consultation with staff, responding to critical incidents, or it can be doing a formal professional learning. And we'll give you a flavour of what our typical week looks like, and you can get a sense of kind of how we blend that casework with support and development work. So casework is about 80% of our work, okay? And that is where we work directly with the child. It could be doing an assessment or an intervention. It may be observations. It may be meeting with parents, school staff. And that's usually, you know, complex cases. It's very time intensive. And I suppose really when you can see the number there on our screen, we have a reach of about 9,000 cases per year. The same with indirect consultation. And I suppose that's if you think of our entire school population, we have to look at other ways of reaching our children. And that's only, like, as we see there on screen, 1%. So a lot of our work in support and development, that gives us a huge reach. You can see there 36% of our school population, because we're really looking at increasing that reach to teachers, embedding good teacher practice, and increasing school capacity. So if you look there, like, for example, next week I'll be organising a cluster meeting with my schools who work in multidisability classes and special school settings. So that's where we come together as a group of teachers, and we bring maybe 2 to 3 cases for a discussion. We wouldn't be naming children, it's all unnamed consultation, but that they have an opportunity as a group to share their school experiences, to share resources. For example, when I go through my week, you'll be able to see that I spent a lot of time this week working on student support teams, or pastoral care teams as they used to be called. We do some formal and professional trainings. For example, you can see there at the bottom of the screen, we do programs on teacher classroom management. Friends is a resilience anxiety reducing program. Get Up, Stand Up is a transition program for 6th class students. Grainne referenced school reluctance. I'm involved in action research on literacy and supporting traveller and Roma children in our school. A lot of work on trauma-informed practice. So really, there's huge variety in our work. And if you have an interest, you are allowed run with that. So that's really good. So again, huge variety to our work in NEPS. Do you want to come in here, Grainne, just on the type of work a little bit more?
The type of work I'm doing, or the type of work?
No, it's just our slide there on working within NEPS, you know, our special interest group slide.
Yeah, so as Caitriona mentioned, I know Caitriona's involved in, like, the National Literacy Group, but I've been involved in a National Critical Incident Working Group, and I'm also involved in one around cultural and linguistic diversity. So that might be helping to develop a lot, I suppose, our group is thinking strategically about what are the needs that are emerging within the wider population, and how can we, using I suppose, our knowledge of psychology and our understanding of evidence and research-based practice, think about, well, what are the best interventions? How can we best support our school communities so that we can support most of the children or all of the children in the school as, I suppose, equitably as possible. And so that actually, I think a lot of our work, and we do spend, I know Caitriona said that we spent 80% of our time doing individual work, but actually we're always thinking about, when we're doing our individual work, like, is this happening for more than one child at this school? Am I seeing this emerging more and more in our schools, and actually feeding that information up so that actually at a more systemic or national level, we can develop resources and develop supports and practices for parents and children and teachers within those school communities. I think that you know, and we do have great autonomy, I think, within our work in NEPS. It's one of the things that, the way that I might like to practice, you know, I spend a lot of time, you know, doing consultation, and I have involvement in some of the universities around teaching consultation. And so that would be how I would practice. But somebody who's in the office beside me might support their schools just as well as I am, but doing it in a very different way. And I suppose as long as your practice is moral and ethical and fulfills the guidelines, and you can demonstrate actually this is the effect of the work that I'm doing, really we're very privileged to have the autonomy to practice in the way that we like, as long as it, you know, is fulfilling the ethical guidelines of the PSI.
Yes, yeah, and Grainne, there's great supervision as well. Absolutely, so each of us would have individual supervision, and then we also have group consultation with peers, and there's fantastic CPD. So again, if at a personal level, if you want to, like last year, I would have got trained up on a CERTS model. That's a program to support our autistic children in our schools. Then we would have at a regional level, there may be guest speakers invited over from the UK or nationally. And then we'd also have what we call our business meetings. So that's where, as an organisation, we come together, and there's great autonomy, as Grainne mentioned there, and the work, because the work is allocated as well in a very fair and transparent way. So if Grainne wanted to go today, she could see exactly how many schools I'm working with, and vice versa. So you know, it's all very equitable. So we might give you a flavour of what a day or a week looks like. So this week, for example, I'm currently reviewing the student support teams I have 3 post-primary schools, and I'm currently in the process of reviewing their student support teams. So Monday morning, I would have sat in on a student support team for students in 1st, 2nd and 3rd year. And then on Wednesday, I went back to the school and sat in on their student support team for 5th, 6th years and TYs. So again, we know that the student support team is a mechanism when we're thinking about the school system for any student who they have concerns about, whether it's learning, emotional, social, behavioural, attendance. Actually, this week, one of my schools, there were two children with very recent diagnosis, one a chronic heart disease and another student epilepsy. So it's really interesting to see what are the formal mechanisms in schools for children to be raised and discussed, and what actions are schools taking. And then I also did some consultation work this week. One, because I was in my 2nd levels, one was for supporting a student who had transitioned into 1st year into mainstream. And she presents with a mild intellectual disability. So she was struggling with activities like they were going to swimming and changing afterwards, and the organisation of moving to a large post-primary. So that kind of work. And yesterday I went along with an interpreter to meet with a family here from Ukraine, and her little boy clearly has autism, and I suppose understanding and building awareness around that and ensuring that supports are in place. So that's such variety. And this morning, I've just given an input to Mary I, just down the road from yourselves, on one of the literacy tools that NEPS helped to develop with our Education Research Centre. So that's a literacy tool for screening all 1st year students. And now I am obviously speaking to yourselves. So Grainne, you might share some of the activities you got up to this week in NEPS.
Yeah, well, I suppose it started with Monday when actually the storm caused actually quite a disruption of my day. So what I planned to do that morning, which I was supposed to be in a school, meeting a young person who has arrived in Ireland and had lived in another European country and has quite complex learning needs, but his parent, when they arrived in this country, didn't have access to GP or couldn't access any of the services. So I've been working with his school and his parents to try and support him to be able to access things like speech and language therapy and OT and all the other needs that he will need in order to I suppose thrive and to do as well as he had been doing in his other country of origin. So I was actually met at, sorry, I'm at his school now at the moment where I've been meeting with this young person as well. So that's on Monday morning. I was supposed to do that, but instead, because of the storm and this young person wasn't able to go to school, I was writing up some consultation records from my previous school visits. And in the afternoon, I was actually developing content with one of my colleagues in Dublin around consultation that we were going to be delivering to trainee psychologists in UCD in January. Then on Tuesday, I had a team meeting. So that usually is like half a day. We'd meet once a month with the other members of our team. So I'm on Team Galway too. So I met with them and we discussed, things that were emerging in terms of like the wider NEPS, so national, regional, thinking about our regional meetings that are coming up. And then I suppose like local issues that are happening in our team. So we do things like solution-focused reflective teams. So a person from a team might present something that's happening in terms of their casework, and we as a team might think together about how, I suppose, where they're feeling stuck in terms of what's happening, and I suppose how can we, ideas that we might have about how we could move forward. Then on Tuesday evening and Wednesday, I was actually in Grainne. I was meeting aspiring psychologists at a conference there for the Northern Ireland Psychology Association. So it was students from Queen's University, Ulster University and the Open University. And there were lots of different speakers talking about different aspects of psychology. So there were people talking about doing PhDs by research. There were people talking about very interesting companies like, around cybersecurity and people working in like social media, and they're looking for psychology graduates, and then then traditional consultancy firms like Accenture and PwC. So psychology students are in high demand is what I emerged. I was encouraging them all to do professional training, obviously. And then yesterday I was in a school in the morning. And then I was writing up some case notes. And then again, this morning I was in the school, and here I am with you now this afternoon. So I think there's a great variety of work that we do as psychologists and as psychologists working in schools. And I suppose because we get the privilege of working with, children and young people and their families in community, we get a great opportunity to see what's happening in practice. So it's not just, I suppose, psychology in a clinical setting, but it's really psychology within the community. And I think that's often what differentiates our practice from, people who are working in more health-based settings. So I just suppose leading on to that idea of, is educational psychology for me? I suppose what we would advocate about training to be an educational psychologist, particularly an educational psychologist who's going to work in an education-based service, whether that's, if you go to Northern Ireland, you might be working in the Education Authority. If you're in the Republic, you might be working in NEPS or another education-based. So some of the ETBs employ educational psychologists as well. So we would say it's about that idea of being with younger children and young people and their families and school communities in the community. So we are based in the community with them. We're going into their schools, thinking and meeting them within that community-based context. And a lot of our work is based on the idea of building consistent relationships. So we might, hopefully, since I've joined NEPS, I've had different schools every year, but I understand how I've built an effective relationship with this one school and how I can continue to build that going forward, or my next colleague will continue to enhance and build that relationship, because I suppose they have a relationship with the entity of NEPS. The idea of being able to work with children and their teachers and their caregivers in non-clinical settings. That idea of the diversity between that direct and indirect casework, whether it's doing individual assessment or intervention with a child, or whether it's doing more consultation with the important adults in their school systems. I suppose, as you are alluding to throughout this, it's the idea of being a practitioner psychologist, an applied psychologist. We're applying psychological theories within educational or community-based settings. And I suppose we have a great opportunity to, I suppose, think about the idea of cultural and linguistic diversity within our schools, and I suppose advocating and elevating maybe minoritized communities within the work we do. And instead of thinking about just, I suppose, the middle elements of society or our communities, we're thinking about, well, who are the people that are on the margins? Who are the people whose voices maybe aren't being represented or elevated within this context? And how are we supporting these people to thrive within the education system or the community system going forward? I suppose, and I think a real unique part of our work, not only as educational psychologists, because as Caitriona said, in NEPS, we have counselling psychologists and clinical psychologists, so all practitioner psychologists, those three, in the same way educational psychologists go and work in the HSE, our colleagues that are traditionally seen in the HSE can come and work in NEPS. But we have that opportunity to think about influencing government policy. So thinking about how we can apply psychological theory within that universal context, and how psychology is, how it's important to take into account those human science factors when we're developing policies, when we're thinking about implementing in practice. And we have a unique role in terms of that within the department. And I suppose it's thinking about influencing at a school system level. So like I said, if you see themes or, you know, particular queries emerging over and over again within our practice, as psychologists and as people who are focused on, you know, data-informed practice, we might say, well, actually, I'm noticing a trend in that there's lots of children coming to your attention with language difficulties. I wonder, would it be helpful if we were to do an intervention with all of your school staff about how best to support that? But because that actually might be the psychosocial intervention or the psychoeducational intervention that is going to have the most impact for more children within that community. It's not to say that we don't do individual practice, but we're always thinking about, well, how can we support all children within this community? And the idea, you know, I suppose as a psychologist, you know, research and action, or, you know, evidence-based practice is the key, the heart of our work. And so we're encouraged, and I suppose, you know, there's huge opportunities to continue to engage in research alongside our practice. So as Caitriona mentioned about action-based research, so it can be little mini projects in school, or it can be larger scale projects across a whole region or the whole national context. So we're really encouraged to have, you know, research at the heart of the things that we do, both in terms of our practice and in terms of embedding research-based practices.
Great, Grainne. And next coming up is, if you want to give a whistle stop tour, Grainne, of the three
just
training
routes.
Time.
So there are three on this island of Ireland. There are 3 professional training programs for educational psychology, and they're based in Mary I in Limerick, in UCD in Dublin, and in Queen's University in Belfast. Now you can also do professional training like your degree in psychology from Ireland will be recognised also in the UK, Scotland, so in England, Scotland and Wales. So there's one training course in Wales, there's one training course in Scotland, and there are 14 training courses in England. They all have the same basic requirements. So on these 2 islands, the requirements to do professional training are equitable across them. So you need to have a minimum of a 2.1 honours degree in psychology. And you need to have at least 2 years full-time experience working. Now, they might say in the field of education. I suppose in general, it's seen as working with children and young people and their families. And I suppose having an understanding of the educational context is important. So understanding, well, this is, you know, because I suppose you spend, like, children are predominantly spending their time within an educational context. So anything that's happening outside that is going to have an impact on their education. If you think back to that ecological systems here, the things that are happening there are impacting. Now, some people ask us, you know, do I need to have a master's to get onto professional training? So, you know, Caitriona and I would both have had additional qualifications in addition to our Bachelor of Degree, our BA or our BSc in psychology. but there is no minimum requirement. I suppose what we'd always say is that you want to be able to demonstrate to the universities or to the directors of the training programs that you can engage in high-level research. So you can engage in doctoral level research where you're going to be making a unique contribution to the field and you'll be able to defend it in your viva. So sometimes we suggest to people, and you can see about the type of work experience you can get by being a research assistant. Sometimes if you haven't, had the opportunities, and masters are obviously very expensive, you maybe getting a job as a research assistant, you can say, well, I've been contributing to research. I understand, ethical research practices. I've been involved in this data collection. I've been involved in this data analysis. I've been able to write up and contributing to writing up significant bodies of research. So that's sometimes a question that comes up. So I just wanted to get it in before I forgot. The other types, so we've just listed some kinds of opportunities that might be good about getting experience in the field. So in NEPS this year, we're piloting a project about education, well-being, or mental health practitioners in schools. So they will be, I suppose, people with primarily, I suppose, psychology degrees, or some people might have education degrees, and they will be doing low-level interventions, psychosocial interventions in schools and supporting school communities as part of a wider well-being project. So the focus will be on well-being. And I suppose it's piloting at the moment, but I suppose there is a hope that this will continue for a few years going forward. Things like experience in education doesn't, as Caitriona said, it doesn't need to be experience as a teacher. It's experience in understanding an educational context. So, when you've got your degree, some people might get jobs as like be able to get registered with the Teaching Council, but some people might get to work as a special educational needs. You might get work in an autism class, in a special school, working in early years. Even voluntary work, if you've done it working maybe with Childline or Bardstown or the Samaritans, that's all considered. It doesn't have to be paid work experience in order to count. It's really about when you're filling in your application form or where you're doing your interview that you're able to demonstrate how you're applying psychology within this context. So I suppose having that psychological lens. As Caitriona mentioned, some of the third level colleges have disability offices where they employ assistant psychologists or psychology assistants, and that's a great opportunity. And the HSE every year have a very large scale assistant psychology program, working predominantly in, I suppose, usually the easiest, or not the widest one, but the widest number of opportunities is working in primary care. So in terms of preparing for your interview for doctors, so if you've, decided to go down this route of looking to be an educational psychologist and you've got your 2 years postgraduate experience and you have your degree, your primary degree in psychology, because that is what you need to have. Other people have come to us and said, oh, I have a degree in education, but actually, and I hope most of you here have a primary degree in psychology, and you can check on the PSI and the BPS website about which degrees or which university degrees are recognised in terms of being recognised in order to go forward for professional training. So sometimes, as we said, it's about keeping, research and evidence-based, research-based practices at the heart of our work of applied psychologists. So being able to keep yourself informed about what's happening in the field of psychology, and in particular, if you're going for educational training, what's happening in the field of educational psychology, whether that's reading journal articles, whether that's, working as a research assistant, or maybe if you're working as an assistant psychologist or in Barnardo's, you might be able to keep up with the research about what is currently happening in the field. What is educational psychology focused on the moment? Lots of people, I listen to lots of psychology-based podcasts, and they're often, a good way of keeping up with research because they might have different speakers who are talking about their own research, getting an opportunity to go to, the PSI conference or the BPS conference, whatever it might be, and listening to other people present their research. Thinking about opportunities that might be available to you to present your own research, to either colleagues, so it might be at the PSI conference or the early years psychology conference. So there's thinking about any of those opportunities to present your research, because then it might be published and you'll be able to name that in your applications. Sometimes I think reading peer-based, peer-reviewed research is really important, because some of the universities ask you to do what we call an to create an abstract summary. So I suppose reading pieces of research and then looking at the abstract afterwards and thinking, would I have been able to make that? Even understanding there's a difference between, structured and unstructured abstracts, and which is, what is the difference between those two? And sometimes a structured abstract can make you think about, what do I need to include when I'm writing my research summary? The idea, of having a good understanding of the code of ethics. So if you're applying to the, UCD or Mary I, you'd be looking at the PSI code of ethics. If you're applying to Queen's or any of the ones based in Scotland, Wales or England, you'd be looking at the BPS code of ethics. Essentially, the codes of ethics are, they're the same code of ethics, but it's just important to understand if there might be minor differences between them. Because sometimes you're asked to write about an ethical question, or in interview you might be asked an ethical question that has emerged in your research. The idea of when you're writing or when you're talking about your experience or practice, it's thinking as a psychologist. So how have you applied psychology to your current work, to the exemplars you've given? How did I, how was I thinking and practicing as an aspiring psychologist, as an assistant psychologist? And final things, most universities, as part of your application, you have to make a research proposal. Now, you're not held to that research proposal typically, but you are, I suppose it's to have that you have an understanding of how to make a research proposal. So I think
brilliant, Grainne. So we might stop, Grainne, for questions. Yeah. I'll stop sharing and see if anyone for the last few minutes would like to come in with a question for myself, for Grainne.